It began with a collision of two very different forces. On one side was Robert De Niro, the embodiment of method acting, a man who lived and breathed his characters with an almost religious devotion. His preparation was legendary. He didn't just play a role, he became it. Months before a shoot, he would vanish into his research, studying accents, mannerisms, the smallest tics of human behavior until his body no longer belonged to De Niro but to whoever lived inside the script. Directors knew that once De Niro committed, there was no breaking him. He was steel, cold, unflinching. On the other side was Don Rickles, the chaos merchant of Hollywood, a man who thrived on detonating order just to watch the pieces scatter. He didn't care for rules, traditions, or the invisible codes that actors lived by. To him, all that reverence for the craft was a circus act, a shield fragile men built to protect themselves from the real world. Rickles was born to shatter shields. His comedy wasn't about immersion, it was about destruction. He had built his empire on tearing down the untouchable, mocking the powerful, dragging gods back into the mud with a single insult sharp enough to draw blood. He was the court jester who could make kings sweat, the man reckless enough to hurl grenades into the most delicate of moments and grin as the shrapnel flew. So when Scorsese, in his hunger for authenticity, placed Rickles in the world of Casino beside Robert De Niro, it was like locking dynamite in a vault and daring someone to light a match. De Niro walked onto set like a general leading an army, every step heavy with authority. He was Ace Rothstein before the cameras even rolled, razor-focused, carrying the weight of Vegas's empire in his eyes. Nothing about him was accidental. The cut of his tailored suit was chosen with surgical precision. The way he folded a napkin on the dinner table wasn't casual. It was rehearsed, deliberate, an extension of his character's obsessive control. Even the way he blinked carried meaning, a fraction slower, a fraction colder, as though his very eyes had been trained to intimidate. To De Niro, this wasn't play acting. This was battle. Acting was war, and discipline was the only weapon that mattered. But to Rickles, the sight of all that seriousness was irresistible. It was comedy's biggest target gift-wrapped and waiting to be torn apart. Where De Niro saw a battlefield, Rickles saw a stage. Where De Niro demanded reverence, Rickles smelt arrogance. And arrogance was the one thing Rickles could never stomach. It didn't matter if you were a movie star, a mobster, or the President of the United States, Rickles had made a career out of cutting giants down to size. And Robert De Niro, the actor the world treated like a deity, was suddenly within arm's reach. The first time Rickles laid eyes on him in character, he didn't see a genius actor disappearing into a role. He saw a man hiding behind silence, intensity dripping from every controlled gesture, and to Rickles that wasn't art, it was theater, self-importance disguised as talent. His instincts flared. He leaned forward, eyes glittering with mischief, and did what Don Rickles had always done best. He went straight for the jugular. The cameras were rolling. Scorsese hovered at the monitor, his brow furrowed, holding his breath as De Niro delivered a line like a surgeon making a precise incision. And then, out of nowhere, Rickles cut through the air. His voice, sharp and mocking, hit like a bullet. "That's it? That's how you're gonna do it? They gave you awards for this? My cousin sells carpet with more passion than that." The set froze. A crew that had spent weeks tiptoeing around De Niro's perfection suddenly buckled under the weight of laughter. Technicians smothered grins behind their hands. One grip dropped his clipboard, shoulders shaking. Even the extras glanced at each other, wide-eyed, as though they had just witnessed a public assassination. De Niro's face didn't crack. Not a twitch. But inside that silence, something shifted. Rickles had done what no director, no critic, no rival had ever managed. He had pierced the armor. He had exposed the humanity beneath the myth. For Rickles, that moment wasn't a throwaway gag. It wasn't just another insult tossed into the void. It was a declaration of war. He had found his perfect victim, the untouchable idol the entire industry bowed before, and he was going to dismantle him piece by piece. The war escalated fast. Every morning, De Niro arrived on set armed with preparation. His script was dog-eared and littered with scribbles. He carried the weight of research in his bones, 1,000 hours of study hardened into muscle memory. He wasn't Robert anymore. He was Ace Rothstein, the casino king who demanded obedience with every glance. But Rickles didn't show up with scripts. He didn't need preparation. He prowled the set like a predator circling prey, waiting for the perfect moment. He thrived on silence, the one fragile second when De Niro's focus reached its peak, when the actor was fully submerged in his character. That was when Rickles struck. His timing wasn't measured in beats, it was measured in disruption, in the art of stealing thunder at the height of a storm. And with every jab, every perfectly placed insult, the battle deepened. One afternoon, De Niro was in the middle of a tense scene. The casino lights glittered like a kingdom of greed around him. Scorsese leaned in with hawk-like intensity, and the entire crew seemed to hold their breath. De Niro delivered his lines with surgical sharpness, every syllable balanced like glass. Then, right when the scene was reaching its boiling point, Rickles leaned over, deadpan, and muttered just loud enough for everyone to hear. "That's the big performance? That's the guy they give the awards to? My uncle's butcher had more passion cutting salami." The crew broke. The camera wobbled from muffled laughter. Even Scorsese, furious at the disruption, couldn't hide the smirk tugging at his lips. De Niro froze, his face flushing with fury beneath the icy calm of his character. But he said nothing. He swallowed it, restarted, and carried on. Rickles, meanwhile, strutted off the set like a man who had just planted a flag on enemy soil. And it wasn't just once. Rickles made a ritual out of ambushing him. Between takes, when De Niro sat quietly, sinking deeper into his role, Rickles would stroll by and drop lines like, "Look at this guy, sitting there like a funeral director. Somebody tell him it's a movie, not a wake." Or he'd clap him on the shoulder and sneer, "You practicing to play a corpse? You nailed it. Don't move, you'll win an Oscar." The pattern was brutal. De Niro wanted control. Rickles thrived on wrecking it. The crew waited for it, bracing for Rickles's bombs like soldiers under fire. Sometimes, the laughter came like thunder. Other times, a heavy silence followed, the kind that revealed just how personal the attacks had become. This wasn't playful ribbing. Rickles wasn't improvising for laughs. He was cutting at De Niro's pride, breaking the man Hollywood called untouchable. But the strangest thing, De Niro never fired back. He clenched his jaw, he absorbed it, and he went back to his role. And that, more than anything, fueled Rickles's rage. Because what Rickles despised most wasn't just De Niro's seriousness. It was his refusal to play the game. Beneath the jokes, something darker pulsed. To most people, Don Rickles's insults were a badge of honor. If he shredded you on stage, it meant you'd been baptized by the master. But with De Niro, it was different. The jokes weren't just for laughs. They carried a weight, a bitterness, like Rickles was cutting deeper than necessary. Rickles had come up on the streets, sharpening his tongue in neighborhoods where survival meant knowing how to talk faster and hit harder than the next guy. His comedy was forged in the fire of mockery, humiliation, and quick retaliation. Respect wasn't given, it was earned, and usually earned through laughter. That was the code Rickles lived by. And when he looked at Robert De Niro, with his stiff suits, his monk-like silence, and his self-serious method acting, all Rickles saw was a man who thought he was above it. It burned him. Because to Rickles, comedy was truth, and truth didn't hide behind scripts or character studies. Truth hit you like a slap in the face, raw and unfiltered. De Niro's obsession with discipline, his refusal to break, felt like arrogance disguised as art. Rickles despised that. He despised the silence, the intensity, the way De Niro seemed untouchable. Off-set, Rickles would rant about him to fellow comics. "The guy thinks he's the Pope of acting," he'd sneer. "Sits there like he's curing cancer. It's a movie. You're not saving the world, Bobby. You're just mumbling into a camera." His friends would laugh, but the bite in his voice was unmistakable. This wasn't just material. It was venom. Part of it was generational. Rickles represented the loud, brash showman who dominated clubs in the 50s and 60s, where charisma mattered more than craft. De Niro was the face of the new Hollywood, actors who disappeared into their roles, worshipped by critics for their authenticity. To Rickles, it was as though men like De Niro had taken the spotlight away from performers like him. Men who relied on guts, instinct, and the power to control a room with their personality alone. So every insult on set wasn't just a gag, it was a strike against everything De Niro stood for. It was Rickles' way of reminding the world that no amount of Oscars, no glowing reviews, no method technique could shield someone from the truth of a well-timed insult. It wasn't just teasing. It was war of philosophies, comedy versus drama, chaos versus control. And the more De Niro stayed silent, the more Rickles despised him. Because silence, to Rickles, wasn't dignity. It was surrender. And Rickles hated nothing more than a man who refused to fight back. By the third week of filming, the set wasn't just a workplace, it was a battlefield divided clean down the middle. On one side stood the loyalists of laughter, the crew members who lived for Don Rickles' ambushes. They gathered in clusters during breaks, whispering bets about when he'd strike next, their eyes darting toward him like gamblers waiting for the dealer to flip a card. When Rickles finally dropped a line, they exploded with laughter before the punchline even landed. For them, it wasn't just funny, it was oxygen. Scorsese's Casino was a tense, suffocating project, thick with pressure and perfectionism, and Rickles' bombs cut through that heaviness like a blade through silk. His insults weren't just words, they were release valves, keeping the set from boiling over. On the other side were the purists, the ones who revered De Niro's process as holy. To them, every interruption wasn't a joke, it was a sacrilege. They watched in fury as Rickles dismantled De Niro's silence, breaking the sacred cocoon of concentration he built for his character. These people saw art being sabotaged, a masterpiece under siege. Every time laughter erupted, they bristled, whispering about lost time, wasted takes, and the cost of chaos. "This isn't stand-up," one grip muttered. "It's Scorsese. It's history. And he's blowing it." Caught in the middle was Scorsese himself. A man of vision, of reverence for performance, but also of instinct. He couldn't deny what Rickles brought. He'd sigh and rub his forehead when Don torpedoed a scene, but rarely did he stop him. Deep down, Scorsese recognized something primal in the disruption. The tension Rickles created wasn't confined to backstage, it bled onto the screen. You could see it in the sharpness of De Niro's glares, in the way conversations snapped with extra bite, in the live-wire electricity that made every scene feel dangerous. Whether Rickles meant to or not, he wasn't just clowning, he was adding fire to the film. The actors noticed too, and soon the cast itself was divided. Joe Pesci, De Niro's bulldog ally both on screen and off, bristled every single time Rickles opened his mouth. Pesci was fire to De Niro's ice, and where his friend stayed silent, Pesci lunged. One afternoon, after Rickles had once again derailed a take with some muttered barb, Pesci snapped. He dropped his script on the table with a crack that echoed through the set. "Let him do his job, Don," he growled, his voice trembling with barely contained fury. Rickles didn't flinch. He never flinched. He leaned back in his chair, lips curling into that wolfish grin, and fired back without missing a beat. "This is my job. Somebody's got to keep him awake before the audience falls asleep." The crew erupted. Electricians laughed until they nearly toppled off their stools. Camera operators shook with stifled chuckles. The room rang with laughter, but Pesci's glare was pure venom. 2 seconds longer and fists might have flown. De Niro, as always, said nothing, his eyes fixed on his script like the chaos didn't exist. That silence drove Rickles mad. Sharon Stone, caught in the middle, described it years later as surreal. "You never knew what was coming," she said. One minute Rickles would cut so deep you wanted to crawl out of the room. The next you'd be laughing so hard you couldn't breathe. It was like living inside the casino itself, unpredictable, unstable, dangerous. The stakes were real, even off camera. She admitted the atmosphere made her performances sharper, her nerves raw. But the toll on De Niro was clear. His focus tightened, his silences deepened, and the set began to feel less like a workplace and more like a war zone. Hollywood outside smelled blood. The whispers spread quickly, oozing out of the production like smoke from a fire. Word was that Rickles didn't just joke about De Niro, he despised him. That the insults weren't playful jabs but sharpened weapons, fueled by genuine contempt. At industry parties, agents leaned close over glasses of scotch. "Rickles is gonna push him too far," one murmured. Producers exchanged knowing looks. Some chuckled, convinced it was all part of Rickles' act, while others shook their heads, sensing something more sinister. The tension became a rumor, then a legend, and Rickles only thrived on it. The danger, the speculation, it was gasoline on his fire. The more people fretted, the harder he pressed, doubling down with insults so sharp they left invisible scars. And the feud didn't die when the cameras stopped rolling. At dinners, Rickles was relentless. Across linen tablecloths, under chandeliers, he jabbed with words that sliced deeper than any knife. "Quiet again, Bobby," he'd sneer between bites. "What's the matter? You practicing for your next role as wallpaper? You're nailing it." Laughter would ripple down the table, forced and uneasy. De Niro would lift his eyes, stare across with that glacial stillness, then drop them back to his plate. No comeback. No anger. Just silence. For the crew and guests who witnessed it, it was torture, like watching a boxing match where only one fighter ever swung. For Rickles, it was blood sport, pure entertainment. For De Niro, it was purgatory. An endless barrage he refused to acknowledge, no matter how deep the cuts. Yet in that silence, Hollywood saw something remarkable. It was more than banter, it was a clash of philosophies, two titans embodying opposite worlds. On one side stood Rickles, the unchained chaos of insult comedy, raw, brash, fearless. On the other side stood De Niro, the immovable wall of method acting, cold, disciplined, untouchable. Every insult, every stifled laugh, every dagger of silence etched itself into the film's legend. Soon, it became impossible to separate Casino from the war that forged it. This wasn't just another Scorsese masterpiece, it was a battlefield disguised as a movie set, and its generals were Rickles and De Niro. When Casino finally reached theaters, audiences saw Robert De Niro at the height of his power. Razor-sharp suits, icy stares, every movement a masterclass in restraint and control. They saw Don Rickles too, not just playing a role, but slipping seamlessly into the world of gamblers and mobsters, his timing flawless, his presence undeniable. But what they didn't see was the war raging in the shadows. They didn't see the whispered insults between takes, the laughter that shattered silence, the private humiliation hiding beneath perfect performances. That invisible war became Hollywood folklore, a secret passed at midnight in smoky bars, too delicious and too dangerous to stay buried. Years later, Rickles still couldn't resist twisting the knife. At roasts, on late-night shows, in interviews, he always found a way to jab at De Niro. He'd smirk and say, "Bobby De Niro, great actor. Too bad he's got the personality of a shoe." The crowds roared, but insiders recognized something deeper. Those weren't just gags. The venom lingered in his voice, faint but real, proof of a resentment that never cooled. Rickles could roast Sinatra, Carson, even presidents, and everyone laughed knowing it was all show. But with De Niro, the insults carried weight. They felt personal. And through it all, De Niro never changed. The silence remained his weapon, his shield, his refusal to descend into Rickles's mud. He never snapped back, never returned fire. That quiet became the fortress Rickles could never breach. And that, more than anything, was what Rickles despised. Because for all his genius, all his fury, all his perfectly aimed bombs, Don Rickles had found the one man in Hollywood he could never conquer. And so he kept swinging, year after year, insult after insult, as though desperate to crack open a wall that refused to fall. When Don Rickles passed away in 2017 at the age of 90, tributes poured in from every corner of Hollywood. He was remembered as the king of insult comedy, the fearless jester who mocked everyone from mob bosses to movie stars. Yet in the stories that resurfaced, one name kept coming up, Robert De Niro. Because no feud captured Rickles's spirit better than the one he waged against the man who wouldn't flinch. Today, Casino stands as one of Scorsese's masterpieces. De Niro's portrayal of Ace Rothstein still hailed as a high point of his career. But behind the shimmering lights of Vegas and the epic story of crime and betrayal lies another legend, the tale of Don Rickles utterly despising Robert De Niro. A story of comedy versus drama, chaos versus control, a jester against a king. And in that clash, Hollywood was reminded of a brutal truth. Even its most untouchable icons were never safe from Don Rickles's fire. If this story gripped you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untold Hollywood battles. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Was Rickles a genius for rattling De Niro, or did he cross the line? Either way, the legend lives on.